Welcome to Living the Smarter Science of Slim, where we provide a scientifically proven lifestyle for long-term health and fat loss by eating more and exercising less, but smarter.
Eat smarter, exercise smarter, live better. I am so ready for that.
Hey everyone, Jonathan Bailor back with another bonus Smarter Science of Slim podcast. Very excited to bring you today's show. We have a very unique and inspirational guest with us today. Dr. Will Tuttle has a master's degree in humanities from San Francisco State University and a PhD in philosophy of education from University of California, Berkeley. He has a very diverse background. He's a professional pianist, composer, and teacher, and he has for the last 15 years, many more at this point, presented at progressive churches, vegetarian and human potential conferences, and international communities throughout the country. He's trained in Korea as a Zen Buddhist monk and has worked extensively on Tai Chi, yoga, meditation, intuition development, and spiritual healing. And today he's joining us to talk about his very provocative book, The World Peace Diet, Eating for Spiritual Health and Social Harmony. I love it. Dr. Tuttle, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm delighted to be with you this morning.
Well, Will, let's back up for a second before we jump into the book. You're not your typical guy here. You have a very diverse background. Can you tell us a little bit about your story and what led you down this road less traveled?
Sure. I actually early on when I was about 20, I faced what it felt like was a midlife crisis, and instead of just going off into business and so forth, right after college, I ended up going on a spiritual pilgrimage and walked from Massachusetts, where I was born and raised, ended up in Tennessee at a hippie commune, ended up eventually in Zen centers, and then eventually in California and San Francisco. And early on, I stopped eating meat, and a few years later stopped eating any animal foods at all. So I'd actually been a vegan for about 33 years. And along the way, as you said, I went to Korea, became a Zen monk for a while, and then through all of it, I played the piano and I'm a composer. And so it was about, I'd say maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I really felt an inner calling to help the world understand the deeper significance of our food choices and how they affect our health, not just our physical health, but our psychological and emotional and spiritual health as well, and the environmental health. But this is all interconnected, and if we want to be healthy and vibrant on every level, which is what I was discovering through my meditation practice and actually through music and through the studies that I was doing at Berkeley. I really had a broad range of studies, plus my own experience eating a plant-based diet. I realized that our whole society actually forces us into a way of life that is not healthy for us, but we can absolutely make positive changes.
Well, Dr. Tuttle, one thing that I appreciate about your message, and of course, correct me if I'm misconstruing this in any way, but your lifestyle choice to be a vegan, it centers around these spiritual and social elements, and not so much like you're not coming from an argument of nutrition or like a hardcore sort of like a scientific debate about like this is the most nutrient rich or nutritious diet. You're tackling it more from a completely different dimension. That is what is motivating you. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a good way to say it, Jonathan. You're right, and I'm glad that you're perceptive about that, because it's true. It's the perspective I think that I bring with the teaching of the World Peace Diet and veganism is not the traditional message that you have to eat this and the nutrient sort of approach. It's much more looking at how the universal spiritual principles operate, that we live essentially in a benevolent universe, and that as we act in ways that are kind and loving to others, and really live our values as deeply as we can, then we will naturally find ourselves happier and healthier on every level. And that's what I found to be true in my life, for sure, on every level.
Well, that seems like such a strong and also difficult to argue with position. It's it makes a lot of sense. And why do you think there's so much? For example, if I'm not a vegan or vegetarian. I have all the respect in the world for individuals who are. But if I was, I would certainly take an approach similar to yours, which is to lead with this: I do it for either spiritual reasons or compassion reasons. And it's not a nutrition conversation. It's a broader conversation. Why do you think their nutrition gets brought in so much? Like it seems unnecessary to me.
That's great. You're right. It's really true, and it's been so interesting to me because I've actually lived for the last 17 years traveling full time around the country, giving lectures and talking to people, and we even go to places, the heart, like for example Iowa, out in the country, little towns, speaking about people eating a totally plant-based diet, and people will come. We've had good turnouts at lectures. And no one ever argues. No one ever, even people who you'd think would be the first to argue, no one ever argues with what I'm saying because you can't argue with it. It's actually, no one, everyone agrees it's true. And the basic idea is that we're all born into a society that forces us from the time we're little kids to participate in mealtime rituals that are not in our best interest. We're forced to eat the flesh and secretions of animals who are mistreated. And so anyone who's doing this is not really doing it out of their own free will. We're just doing it because we're following orders. We were forced to do it as little kids by our parents and teachers and relatives and the media and the government and religion. Every institution in our culture is organized around basically propelling us against our will to do this. And that when we look at what animal agriculture actually does to the environment and to our health and to animals, and to our spiritual sensitivity, it really is not in our best interest on any of those levels. So that's basically, I think people see that, and it's really, you can't really argue with it, especially if we talk about it in more depth. But what comes up, of course, for people is, well, where am I going to get my protein? Or where am I going to get my calcium? So people have been taught, I think, these official stories that you cannot get enough protein if you don't eat meat, or you cannot get enough calcium if you don't eat dairy products, but they're not true. I mean, there's millions of people who are living evidence that this is absolutely not true. You can get really all you need from plant-based sources.
I appreciate what you said about there's these rules or standards that, like you mentioned, for example, like where you're going to get your protein, where you're going to get your calcium, and there seems to be a just myriad sources of those. One example is there's also this idea that if someone is eating a plant-based diet, that in and of itself is honoring the environment and honoring their body, where obviously we both know that with some of plant agriculture that is taking place in our country with the monocropping and the just complete pillaging of the soil system and a Snickers bar. I mean, the amount of petroleum that goes into producing a Snickers bar is astronomical, although it is plant-based. So how do we also pull apart and say, is it enough to be plant-based, or is there a more meta level, which is eating with this end goal in mind, and then let's identify the sources that best do that?
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think that the most important thing really is to do the best we can to live our values, which is, I think, compassion for animals, for ecosystems, for ourselves, and for our own health, our own cells in our own body. And so monocropping and genetically engineered foods are devastating our ecosystems, growing huge amounts of grain, which most of them are fed to animals, of course, is devastating to the ecosystem. And I think if someone moves to a plant-based diet for ethical reasons, it's important to do it, as you're saying, with wisdom, so that we're eating a whole foods, organically grown, as local as possible. Grow your own, of course, is the best. But basically, if we do this, if we move in this direction toward eating a more whole foods, plant-based diet, we are going to be minimizing our environmental footprint, obviously. And not only that, we'll be bringing into our bodies unprocessed foods without the chemicals, or if they're organic, which is, we only buy organic, and we buy virtually only unprocessed foods ourselves. And with time, I think these are the foods that begin to just taste the best. I think very often there's a transitional period that people have to go through because we get kind of addicted to certain substances and tastes of food. And the food industry is not about making people healthy. It's about making a profit. So they're trying always to bring so-called foods to market that have a long shelf life and that will be addictive, that people want more, so they're very high in fat, sugar, and salt, and so forth. So as we move toward a more healthy diet that's more compassionate to animals and better for the environment, we actually will find, I have found, that the food, once we go through a transition period, gets just more and more utterly delicious. I mean, it gets so wonderfully tasty as we're eating fresh fruits and vegetables and grains and so forth and fixing them. We learn how to fix them well, and we find we have a huge amount of energy. Weight is not an issue typically at all, and our health. I haven't been to a doctor in over 40 years, and generally speaking, people who eat a whole foods plant-based diet in general have much lower rates of the kinds of diseases that are just rampant in our society today, like obesity and osteoporosis and diabetes and liver disease, kidney disease, heart disease, autoimmune diseases. All these things are much lower in people who are eating a vegan diet. So it basically, it is. I never did it for my health, but for me as a side benefit, it's been great.
Well, and Will, what are your thoughts on this? There's been a transition in the vernacular between, for example, vegan and vegetarian and whole foods plant-based, and I think that that's a move in the right direction because someone could eat a vegan diet, as we alluded to earlier, that is horrible for their body as well as for the environment. Right? I think Dr. Joel Fuhrman calls it a junketarian, where they're eating, these processed burger meat-like things which go through more processing and have more ingredients in them than anything you can ever imagine, and is really not honoring anything. And then imagine that on one end of the spectrum, and imagine on the other end of the spectrum. Obviously, there's many examples of this, but one that comes to mind easily is when we think of Native American cultures in the U.S. and how they so honored the earth and so honored the environment. At the same time, they would also consume animals, but they would do so in a very spiritually sound fashion. Do you think there is any place for any culture that is sustainable and healthy and spiritually sound to eat both a whole food, nutrient-dense, sustainable plant and whole food, nutrient-dense, sustainable animal diet?
Well, that's a good question. I can't really say, for any culture. I mean, there may be cultures, in extreme climates, perhaps, that would need to eat, apparently if the people are there, eat animal-based foods. But I think for us today in our society here, the people who are listening, the vast majority of the people in the world, there really isn't any reason to eat animals or animal-based foods. I mean, the animal-based foods, dairy products for sure are toxic on many levels. I mean, they have substances in them like casein that we're really not designed to ever have in our system and cause all kinds of inflammation and problems. And I think eggs also are really difficult for us to handle physiologically. And all of these foods do require cruelty. There's no way around it. I mean, unless you're going to eat roadkill or something like that. But basically, in order to stab an animal, you've got to have someone that's going to do that, which tends to desensitize the human being who does it. And there aren't any nutrients that are necessary that we need we can't get from plant-based sources. So there isn't any reason to confine animals or to hunt animals, to terrorize them, to kill them for nutrients. Yeah, plants create all of the lipids, all of the different essential fatty acids, all the amino acids that create all of the proteins, all of the they bring up the vitamins and minerals and so forth, and they create the carbohydrates, which are really the fuel that we're designed to run on. And there aren't any carbohydrates in meat at all. So meat doesn't really provide energy. I mean, it provides, there's fat and protein, basically, which we can break down. But it's basically harder on the system. And it was interesting. I was at a place where there was a Native American village, a museum in Virginia, in the mountains of Virginia. And I asked the docent, they had some corn growing. They were showing how these people lived. And I said, so what percentage of the food that they ate was this corn that they grew? And the woman said, well, it was only about 1 or 2%. And I said, really? So I guess what were they eating then? And she said, well, actually, I said, what was the percentage of meat? She said, well, meat was about 1 or 2%. I said, really? They only ate 1 or 2% was meat and fish? And she said, yeah, about 1 or 2% was meat and fish. I said, so what the heck were they eating? And she said, well, basically they were gatherers. They gathered acorns. They ate a huge amount of acorns, and they would grind those, and then they ate a lot of roots and nuts and berries and seeds and so forth, and they would live in an area for a year or two, then they would move to another area for a few years, and they would travel around and gather, and they were primarily gatherers. And I think there's a little bit of a mythology. I mean, there were some tribes, obviously, that it did eat more animal flesh, but the Native Americans some tribes, I've talked to Native Americans that said that they were basically completely vegan. And so I think maybe not vegan in the sense that the word vegan was actually created to account for ethics. I mean, it means not to kill animals for ethical reasons. They were doing it basically because that was the quickest and easiest way to live. And I think also probably there perhaps was an element of respect for nature, not to harm animals. But I think we can live and be healthy without causing suffering to animals, and so that's what I encourage people to do, to question this idea that we have to kill animals in order to get some nutrients.
And certainly the challenging, must we kill animals to get nutrients is a wonderful question. And I'm curious about the question of if you mentioned veganism rooted in a place of minimizing the destruction of animals, is there a school of thought, or have you come across a school of thought which is just attempting to minimize the destruction of any living life? Because one thing that I always am curious to talk with vegans and vegetarians about, because it's not easy to be a vegan or a vegetarian. We live in a society, as you mentioned, that works very hard to
right.
do other things. That said, obviously there are horribly irresponsible and destructive ways to raise plants. And so much, it seems like, gets talked about this plants versus animals, plants versus animals, plants versus animals, as we have these corn, soy, wheat, monocrop, just literally destroying. It's like salting the earth. Like the way it's being produced is horrible. And it's kind of like nothing's being done about that because we're just like, oh, well, it's plants. Let's just talk about animals. But is there a more macro view, which is just, let's focus on that which is destroying the planet and focus less on plants versus animals? What are your thoughts?
Great question. Okay, I think it is plants versus animals. There's two kinds of agriculture. There's plant agriculture and animal agriculture. From the very beginning, animal agriculture was from the very beginning, plant agriculture was mainly women's work, and it was in many ways work that brings out the best in people. We're working with the cycles of nature. We're working with the miracle of life, bringing forth new life, this amazing abundance. We plant one seed, we get plants that give literally hundreds or thousands of seeds. And so it's working with the miracle of life and supporting that. Animal agriculture from the very beginning was men's work. It brought out the worst in people who had to do it. We had to confine animals, steal from them. The animals were always resisting. It wasn't like plant agriculture where nature is essentially cooperating and giving. There was the sense of stealing babies from their mothers and impregnating the mothers against their will, and this stealing of their products, stealing of the babies, stabbing and dominating and violating and exploiting other living beings, enslaving them, and it led, as I point out in the World Peace Diet, to a patriarchal culture of violence over women, domination of land, ownership of land, war, slavery, and a very highly hierarchical society where the rich dominate the poor. And this is essentially embedded in foods that require us to dominate other living beings. So when we look at the way we do agriculture today, since we live in today, primarily what is a herding culture. Our culture today is organized around owning animals as property for food and eating a lot of meat, dairy products, and eggs. We now do plant agriculture the way we do animal agriculture. We do plant agriculture as violence, as exploitation, as domination. It's a war against nature. We do monocropping. We do genetic engineering. We douse the fields with pesticides and herbicides, fungicides, and then we feed 90% of all of this grain that you talked about, the wheat, the corn, the soy, cottonseed, basically everything we're growing is not fed to people. It's fed to animals who are confined by the hundreds of thousands, by the millions in stinking sheds where they never see the light of day. They're the ones that are eating all these crops, not people. People are not eating these. We're cutting down the rainforest right now in South America at the rate of an acre per second to grow soybeans to feed to factory farm pigs, cows, chickens, and fish. We're in the middle of the largest mass extinction of species. We're losing dozens of species every single day to extinction, again, driven by overfishing the oceans. We're feeding fish to cows. We're feeding more fish to cows than we are to human beings today to fatten them up. We're feeding these fish also to other animals. We're feeding animals to animals. So this is an agriculture that is based on domination, exploitation, and massive cruelty, not only to animals, but to ecosystems, violence to insect populations, to birds and fish, to wildlife. We have a wildlife services department in the USDA that just does nothing but kill wildlife, kill over 500,000 coyotes every year, bobcats, prairie dogs, everything. It's all done by this form of agriculture. And most people don't realize that the grains that we're growing are being fed to animals, not to people. People are starving while we're feeding most of the grain to animals. So this is the injustice in animal agriculture. And the vision I have, just to kind of wrap it up here, is that we can do plant agriculture the way, in a completely different way, or organic and local gardens can feed everyone on a fraction of the land. And going veganic, there's experiments in doing this now where we don't use any animal inputs. We use just plant-based inputs. We don't need to have manure and blood meal and bone meal and fish meal and so forth at all. And there are experiments now showing that we can actually get higher yields with this kind of agriculture. And we can feed everyone on a fraction of the land. So it's time to reinvent agriculture away from this domination based on animal agriculture to a plant-based agriculture that will feed people in a much more loving and harmonious way. And I think that's the future that's beckoning, so that we can live in harmony with each other, with nature, and with the earth, and be healthier and live with the animals and respect them.
Certainly living with the world in a loving, harmonious way is a noble vision, and one that I can certainly appreciate. And if we have individuals, Dr. Tuttle, who, let's just say, the idea of giving up all animal products is just like they're gonna switch off. I'm sure you've seen this, maybe just where someone hears the word vegan or hears the word vegetarian, and that makes them start saying no in their brain. And because they start saying no, the conversation about peace and harmony cannot continue. So let's say you're an individual who is not willing to just globally say, I'm going to give up all animal products right now. However, you are an individual that says, I do want to live a more compassionate, caring, and loving life. Is there a lifestyle for that individual where you have maybe mostly plants and you find as humanely raised as possible animals, which consist of some percentage of your diet? Is there a lifestyle there? Any hope?
Great question. Thanks, Jonathan. Well, obviously, I think anyone, moving toward a way of living that reduces the amount of suffering we're causing is always a good idea. And I just encourage everyone who's listening to this to make an effort to understand, because not only is it going to make our world more harmonious and happy, it'll make ourself much more harmonious and happy as well. And just to realize that all of us have been injected by a toxic program in our society, forcing us to eat the flesh and secretions of traumatized animals. That's been forced onto us as little infants. You just look at the baby food in any grocery store, and you'll see little jars of turkey and veal and chicken and beef and so forth. So this is something that's been forced on us. And I understand what you're saying. People may switch off and say, I'm not going to go there. So and there's reasons for that. I talk about that in the World Peace Diet, why this program is very deeply embedded into us. But I think anyone can go vegan. I mean, I've actually had people who are former hunters and really hardcore meat eaters, send me an email and say, I read your book and I've gone vegan. So I think anyone can. But I understand what you're saying. Some people may say, well, I don't want to right now, and it's kind of too frightening for me because people don't realize that plant-based food is absolutely delicious, and we're already eating a lot of that anyway. Already, most people are eating diets that do have a lot of plant-based foods in them, obviously. So salads and grains and pastas and potatoes and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and fruits and vegetables and everything else. So there's, we're already eating that. It's just a matter of learning. And there's actually now plant-based alternatives. You can get, Mark Bittman could not tell the difference between real chicken and the chicken that's now being produced. So if someone wants to, they would never know the difference. So I think it's mostly social. People are afraid to go to a restaurant where they can't get a meal and they're with their boss or something like that. It's mostly social. But I think, anytime we move toward greater compassion for others, we're going to find our health getting better, and we're going to find our happiness getting better. And with with the proliferation of alternatives, ice cream, cheese, all the animal foods that people are, eggs. There's now eggs that are being, not literally eggs, but egg substitutes that are apparently, as I've been reading it lately, can be used for so many different things that we don't really need to exploit animals. So I think it's just good to move in the direction toward becoming a vegetarian, for example. If one's already a vegetarian, then toward becoming a vegan. I think just moving anywhere on that line toward buying things that cause less exploitation in general. I would also say not to buy chocolate that comes from people who are slaves in Africa. We shouldn't be exploiting human beings either. We're all animals. We should try to reduce the amount of suffering and exploitation that we're causing. And in the United States, we have a high consumption culture that does cause a lot of exploitation to others. So I think the more we move in, and also I was just in Eastern Europe, and they were telling me, and I think it's true, that the whole world still looks to Americans to be the example. So as Americans, I think we do make a big impact. And I think as we, as Americans, move toward more compassion and sustainability and health and wellness, it'll help the whole world more than we realize.
Well, Dr. Tuttle, certainly appreciate the lifelong effort to help promote that message, because a message of increased humanity, increased sustainability, and increased peace is certainly one we can all rally behind, even if we may disagree on the means. So thank you so much for living a wonderful and inspirational life in that sense.
Well, I really appreciate it, Jonathan. I think the main thing is just to realize that we're all in this together, and to keep questioning the official stories and to keep our hearts open, and remember, it's all about love. Basically, it's just about us being as loving as we can, and that as we sow, so shall we reap. Whatever we put out comes back.
Folks, the man is Dr. Will Tuttle. The book is The World Peace Diet, and you can learn more about Dr. Tuttle at worldpeacediet.org. Dr. Tuttle, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today.
Great. Thank you so much, Jonathan, too.
Listeners, I hope you enjoyed today's conversation as much as I did, and please remember, this week and every week after, eat smarter, exercise smarter, and live better. Chat with you soon.
Wait, don't stop listening yet. If you like the podcast and if there's other ways we can help you, please join us in the Smarter Science of Slim support group, which is freely available at the Smarter Science of Slim website, smarterscienceofslim.com. There you'll find all kinds of free recipes and success stories and just all kinds of fun stuff, like how to help your kids go sane and just great community content.
And just one last thing before you go, if you wouldn't mind heading over to iTunes and up onto Amazon.com and leaving us a review, and then going over to Facebook and liking us, we would hugely appreciate it.